The next part of speech that we're going to look at is the verb. Let's start off by talking about the basics. So, a verb is a word which signifies to be, to do, or to suffer. I am, I rule, I am ruled. There are three kinds of verbs. You have active verbs, neuter verbs, and passive verbs. Active or transitive verbs express an action and imply an agent and an object acted upon. So, for example, I love Penelope. You have the agent, I, the verb, love, and then the object, Penelope. The next type of verb is the neuter verb or intransitive. The intransitive verb expresses neither action nor passion, but being or a state of being. These verbs don't take an object. I am, I sleep, I sit. And the third type of verb is the passive verb, which expresses a passion or an experiencing of something, or the receiving of an action. It implies an action, it implies an object acted upon, and an agent by which it is acted upon. Penelope is loved by me. So Penelope here is the object, is loved is the verb in the passive voice, and the agent is me. All right, now let's talk about number and person in relation to verbs. So verbs, just like nouns, have both a singular and plural form. The plural form includes two or more, and just like pronouns, verbs have three persons: the first, the second, and the third. The first person being the speaker, the second, the one being spoken to, and the third person, the one or the thing or the object being spoken about. In general, verb endings do not change due to the number or person. There are two exceptions to this rule. The first exception is the verb to be in both the past and the present forms. And the second exception is all other present simple verbs with a third person singular subject. So let's take a look at this chart. The first person, you have I love, we love. The second person, you love and you love. The third person, he, she, it loves. So this is the S that I was referring to. This is the second exception. So because the subject is third person and it's singular, we add an S to the end of the verb. And the plural is they love. So the plural in the plural form doesn't change. So it only changes in the third person singular form. The next topic we're going to talk about is moods in relation to the verb. Mood is a particular form or state of the verb showing the manner in which the being, action, or passion is represented. Verbs have 5 moods: the indicative, which declares a thing or asks a question; he loves, he is loved, does he love, is he loved; the imperative, which is used for commanding: stop, let us stay, leave now. So it's important to note that when the subject of the command is the second person, so you, the subject is implied. So we say stop, but what's understood is you stop. And likewise, leave now. But when the subject is first person or third person, it's mentioned. However, you precede it with the word let. So let us stay, let him stay, let them stay, let her stay, etc. The next mood is the potential mood. The potential mood indicates possibility or liberty, power, will, or obligation. It's used along with a modal verb, for example, may, might, will, would, can, could, shall, and should. It may rain, he may go or stay, I can ride, he would walk. The subjunctive mood represents a thing as hypothetical, contingent, or uncertain. It is preceded by a conjunction, for example, if, although. which is either stated or implied. So in the sentence, were he good, he would be happy. What is implied is that if he were good, he would be happy. The subjunctive also indicates that something is suggested or demanded. I recommend that he take some time off. So it's important to know that the verb and the subjunctive is the base form. All right. This is why we don't add an S after take. It's not I recommend that he take some time off, but that he take some time off. On the other hand, if it's the verb to be, then we use the form were. If I were you, for example. The infinitive mood expresses a thing in a general and unlimited manner, without any distinction of number or person. To act, to speak, to be feared. Alright, now let's look at verb forms. The base and present simple forms. The base form is basically the dictionary form of a word. If you look up a verb in a dictionary, the form that you'll find is the base form. Walk, jump, be. The next form is a present simple form, which is the same as the base form with two exceptions. The first is the third person singular subject and the verb to be. So with the third person singular subject, we add S or ES depending on the final sound of the base form. So if it's walk, the verb becomes walks, but if it's miss, misses. And the reason is obvious. If you add a S to miss, it sounds exactly the same. So we need to add an ES, so an extra syllable. And be has three different forms in the present simple. Am for the first person singular, is for the third person singular, and are for all the other forms. The past simple form. So there are two types of verbs. There are regular verbs and there are irregular verbs. For regular verbs, we form the past simple by adding the suffix ed, and this applies to all persons and number. So he, which is third person singular, is he walked. They, third person plural, walked. You, second person, walked. I, first person singular, walked. So it doesn't change. As long as the verb is regular, we add ed. On the other hand, with irregular verbs, there are two situations. The first is with the verb to be. So with the verb to be, it's either going to be was or were. If the subject is singular and first person, so I, or third person, he, she, it, we use was. We use were with all the other persons and number. So plural first person, singular and plural second person, and plural third person. The next situation is irregular verbs other than the verb to be. So with such verbs, there are a countless number of different forms it could take. So strike is struck, eat, ate, speak, spoke. All right, now let's look at the participle forms. The participle derives its name from its participating in the characteristics of both the verb and the adjective. I am interested in meeting him. In this sentence, the participle is interested. Interested is the past participle of the verb interest. The students were bored. Bored, again, is the past participle of the verb bore. So in both of these sentences, the participle form is actually used as an adjective. So we would say with the first sentence, the verb is am, the verb to be, and then interested is the complement. So it's not part of the verb, but rather it completes the meaning. And likewise with bored. Bored is not a verb here. It's a participle, a past participle in particular, that's functioning as an adjective. Having finished his work, he submitted it. In this sentence, we have two participles. We have having, which is the present participle, and the second is finished, which is the past participle. So, as you figured, there are two participles. There's the present and past. So the present, or the active participle, indicates an incomplete action. It is used in the progressive or continuous tense. I am reading a book. The past, or the passive participle, indicates a completed action, and it's used in the perfect tenses and the passive voice. I have read this book several times. Richard is loved by no one. So the past participle form will be the same thing as the past simple form, with the exception of irregular verbs. So with a regular verb, it's going to be, with a verb that's regular, it's going to be walk for the base form, walked for the past simple form, and likewise walked for the past participle form. On the other hand, with an irregular verb, so the base form is drink, the past simple form is drank, and the past participle form is drunk. With the present participle, regardless of whether the verb is regular or irregular, we add an ing. So there's no exception to that. And the ing is added to the base form of the verb. So walk becomes walking and drink becomes drink. Let us now focus on the verb to be and the verb to have. They're both irregular verbs, and we're going to focus on them because they're very frequently used irregular verbs. They're perhaps the most frequently used irregular verbs in the English language. So be, it's used to make the progressive form and the passive voice. Its forms are the following: am, is, are for the present simple, was, were for the past simple, being for the present participle, and been for the past participle. I am going to college. So here it's used to form the present progressive form of the verb. The polio vaccine was discovered by a Canadian doctor. So here we have the passive voice, and so because it's the passive voice, the agent is mentioned at the end, Canadian doctor, and the object is mentioned in the beginning. So the object, the polio vaccine, is a subject of the verb was discovered. Have is used to make the perfect tenses. Its forms are the following: have, has for the present simple, had for the past simple, and having or had for the present participle and past participle, respectively. I have seen that movie already. This is an example of the present participle. I had seen that movie before you did. This is an example of the past participle. I will have left by the time you arrive. This is the future perfect. Another commonly used irregular verb is the verb do. Do is used to make the negative and interrogative or question forms for simple present and past verbs, except for the verb be and modals. Its forms are do, does for the simple, did for the past, and doing or done for the present participle and the past participle. Do you listen to music? So this sentence, if we were to put it in the affirmative form, or in the indicative form, would be you listen to music. In order to make this a question, we need the helping verb do before the subject you. I don't like horror movies. So here we use do along with not in the contracted form to make the sentence negative. Okay, the first sentence originally read, they didn't to know about the test. Okay, so the preposition to is not used after the verb do. Okay, so after do, or the verb to do, we use the base form of the verb without any prepositions. Okay, so it's the bare infinitive. So you have the infinitive, which is to know, and then the bare infinitive is just know. Okay, so you would say they didn't know about the test. So it's, in other words, it's the base form of the verb. Okay, without the preposition to. Did you be there? Okay, so we use did or do as a helping verb with basically every verb except the verb to be. So if you have the verb to be in a sentence and you want to make that sentence a question, you can do so without a helping verb, right? You simply invert the subject and the object. So instead of you were here, were you here? In the third example, you wasn't in class. So you is a bit strange because you, whether you're referring to one person or more than one person, so whether it's singular or plural in terms of its meaning, is treated as though it were plural. So the verb that follows you is always plural. Even if you're just referring to one person, it's plural. So really it's the context that indicates whether or not you intend one person or more than one. My sister speaks French well. Okay, so the rule is that if the verb is present simple and the subject is third person singular, we add an S to the verb. We add an S to the verb, so it becomes my sister speaks. So any third person singular subject would be in the same situation. She has went back home. Okay, so here we have the present perfect tense, so therefore we would use has or have with the past participle form. So the past participle form of the verb go is actually gone. Went is the past simple form. With irregular verbs, often the case is that the past simple and the past participle forms are different, and sometimes, as with this example, they're completely different. I woken up late on Saturday. So woken up is the past participle form of the verb wake, and woke is the past simple form. Okay. So here we don't have any. We don't have the verb have or had. So it's obviously not a perfect tense. It's not a present perfect or past perfect tense. It's the past simple. It's the past simple tense. So therefore, we would just say, I woke up late on Saturday. The boy slided down the hill. Okay, so slide is an irregular verb. Okay, so the past simple form is slid, S-L-I-D. She read the book but didn't like it. The original was didn't like, so we need to add it. Like is what's called a transitive verb. Okay, it's a verb that takes a direct object. You cannot use it otherwise. Okay, you can't just say didn't like what. Okay, you need to actually mention it, otherwise the meaning of the sentence will be incomplete. Okay, so here we would supply the object, so it's a pronoun, it. She read the book but didn't like it. I suggest that he comes up with a good excuse. Now, this sentence may have puzzled you because you probably read it a few times and said, well, this looks perfectly grammatical to me. Well, it's not grammatical, but having said that, don't be surprised if you hear native speakers, say comes, right, with an S. So this goes back to moods. We talked about verb moods. So one of the moods is the subjunctive mood. And if you recall, we use this mood when we're talking about suggestions, okay? Recommendations, obligations. Okay, so here the suggestion is clear, I suggest. Okay, so therefore the verb that's going to appear in the clause that comes after it, the noun clause, is going to be in the subjunctive form. And the subjunctive form essentially looks like the base form, okay, of the verb. So this is why we don't add an S. Okay, for the same reason, we don't add an S after the helping verb do or does. We don't add an S here because it's the base form. Okay, it's the base form of the verb. If you want to get more technical, you would say it's the subjunctive form. But for all intents and purposes, it looks just like the base form, so you may as well say that. There are some exceptions that we're not going to talk about now, but when you study conditionals, you will see other forms. But for the most part, it's the base form that's used. So you would say, I suggest that he come up with a good excuse. Now let's look at the present simple tense. So its form is the present simple form, which we've already discussed. And some of the functions, or the main functions, are the following. First of all, routine. So something you do habitually, something you do often. I get up at 6 every day. He watches TV every night after dinner. The second function of the present simple tense is for a general rule or general knowledge. So stating a fact. For example, the earth circles the sun. The square root of 81 is 9. All right, so the third function of the present simple tense is states. To describe states. I am a student. The lake looks like it's frozen. And a fourth common function of the present simple tense is the immediate future. I leave for Montreal tomorrow. We arrive on Friday. The present progressive tense. Let's start off by looking at the form. So you form the present progressive by adding the verb to be in the present simple form, so that's is, are, am, plus the present participle verb. So the present participle verb is basically the base form of the verb plus ing. The main function of the present progressive tense is to talk about ongoing action at the time of speaking. So if I say I am studying right now, what I mean is at the time of speaking or saying this or writing this, I am studying. She's working on the report right now. Likewise, the meaning of this is at the time of uttering this, she is actually working on the report. A second common function of this tense is the immediate future. So something that's going to happen in the not too distant future. I am picking her up at 7. She's flying to Paris tomorrow. So the present progressive tense, because it's describing an action that's happening at the time of speaking, and it's often or usually it's a temporary action, an action with a definite beginning and a definite end. So if you look at these examples again, I am studying right now. You can imagine, that I began studying, let's say 30 minutes ago, and I'll eventually stop studying. And likewise with working, with picking her up and flying. These are actions with a definite beginning and a definite end. So therefore, it wouldn't make sense to use this tense with verbs that describe beliefs, emotions, or senses, because these things are often not conceived of as being temporary. For example, you wouldn't say, I am believing in miracles, because this isn't a temporary action, but it's something that lasts, perpetually. All right, so the first sentence originally read, what do you do with my phone? Now, there are a number of things that could lead to this mistake, a number of misunderstandings. First of all, let's look at tense, okay, verb tense. So when we have a question, the tense shows in the helping verb. In this case, the helping verb is did, and not in the main verb, do. Okay, so the main verb is going to be the base form, and the base form of the verb does not indicate any time, past, present, or future. It's the helping verb that indicates time. A second source of confusion may be that the fact that the helping verb and the main verb are the same verb. They're different forms, but they're the same verb. So it's important to note that when do is serving as a helping verb, it doesn't have any meaning. It has a function, right? The function is that it indicates the time, it indicates the type of sentence, so this is a question. But it doesn't have a meaning, unlike do, which has an obvious meaning. So this is why if you were to translate this into a language that does not require a helping verb to form a question, there would be no word to translate did. You would translate do, but not did. Okay, now let's look at the second sentence. So the sentence originally read, I'm not knowing him. So the problem with this sentence is that we don't use the ing form or the present participle form for state verbs. So state verbs are verbs that describe a certain condition or state, like a feeling, for example. And know is among the large category of state verbs. So we can't use the present continuous form. Okay, we would use the present simple form. And if we use the present simple form, then we need the helping verb do in order to make it negative. So the helping verb do is used in both questions as well as in negative sentences. So you would say, I do not know him. Or if you want to contract it, you would say, I don't know him. In the third sentence, it originally read, teacher, I know understand. Okay, so very often students, they overuse the negative word know. Okay, so whatever they want to make negative, they use no. However, we don't make sentences negative using no. Okay, in order to make a sentence negative, so let's say the sentence is I understand, we need to do two things. We need to first of all use the helping verb do, okay, and then use the negative word not. Okay, so I do not understand. And if you want to contract it, it becomes I don't understand. The fourth sentence, I am writing to you. This is the correction. The original sentence read, I writing to you. So the student was trying to use the present continuous, but forgot to include the verb to be. So when using the present continuous, when talking about a continuous action, we need the helping verb to be plus the present participle form. So it's like a formula. You need both parts. And the last sentence originally read, does he play basketball? Now, the source of this confusion is that in normal sentences or in declarative sentences, when it's not negative and it's not a question, we would say he plays basketball. We would add the S to play because the subject is third person and singular, and the verb is present simple. However, when this sentence becomes a question, and when we have to use the helping verb, do, the S is added to the helping verb, and the main verb becomes the base form. Okay, so the base form of the verb doesn't change, regardless of the time frame, regardless of the subject, regardless of the person, first, second, or third. Okay, so all that information is in the helping verb. So when we look at does, we know that the subject is third person singular, and we know that the time or the tense is the present simple. The simple past tense. The simple past tense is formed by the past simple form. And as we had discussed before, the past simple form is for regular verbs, you add ed to the base form of the verb, and for irregular form verbs, there are several different forms they could take. So it's simply a matter of memorizing the form if it's an irregular verb. But we're going to talk about the functions of the past simple or the simple past. The first common function and the most basic function is an action completed before the time of speaking. So basically something that happened in the past. The suspect arrived at 2300 hours. She finished the test 10 minutes ago. A second function of the past simple is when we have what's called reported speech. So you're reporting what someone said, and what they said at the time of saying it was in the present simple. But because you're reporting what was said in the past, you're going to use the past simple. So for example, this is what John said: I am a doctor. And if you were to report what he had said, you would say John said that he was a doctor. A third use of the past simple is the unreal conditional. So put simply, the unreal conditional is something that didn't happen. It's a conditional that did not happen, and you use it when you want to speculate about the present or the future. So it did not happen, but it could potentially happen in the future. If I ever said something like that, she would kill me. So there are two past simple verbs here. The first one is said in the conditional clause, and the second is would in the response clause. The past progressive tense. So let's start off by talking about the form. The past progressive tense is formed by the past tense of the verb to be, so was or were, plus the present participle. If you recall, when we're talking about verb forms, we had mentioned that the form of the verb in itself does not indicate a time period. In generally speaking, so the present participle, for example, although the name is present participle, in itself it does not indicate the present tense. And this is why we can use the present participle with in the past progressive tense. Rather, it's the helping verb, was or were, that indicates the tense. And this is why it might be easier to just refer to the present participle as the ing form of the verb, in order not to confuse tense with form. All right, the first common use of the present progressive tense is an ongoing action in the past. So something that happened for a duration of time in the past. She was working on the report when I saw her this afternoon. She was shopping while I was making dinner. While the suspect was fleeing the crime scene on foot, the victim called 911. The first sentence originally read, I drank a bottle of water. Okay, so drank is an irregular verb from the verb drink. Okay, the learner here basically confused the forms and thought that drink was a regular verb, so added ed to it, or ed to one form of it, but rather it's irregular. So it's drink in the present simple, drank in the past simple, and drunk in the past participle. Did you eat all the rice? So the confusion here is from the fact that there's a helping verb. Okay, so as we said before, when there's a helping verb, the tense, the person is indicated by the helping verb. Okay, so in this case, the helping verb is did. Okay, so we make did, which was originally do, past simple. Okay, and the main verb eat becomes the base form of the verb. Okay, so originally what we had was, or if you want to make this a declarative sentence, it would be you ate all the rice. Okay, so you ate all the rice. And when we make this into a question, the ate becomes eat, and then we add did. So did you eat all the rice? I was do my homework when she arrived. Okay, so here it's simply incorrect because it's not the right form for the past progressive. Okay, so the past progressive or the past continuous is formed by adding the verb to be in the past simple form, so was or were, and the ing form or the present participle form of the verb. Okay, so in this case, doing. And in the last sentence, it's another issue with form, okay, and tense as well, perhaps. So this is clearly something that happened in the past, okay? Last night gives it away. So therefore, we would use the past simple form of the verb to sleep, and because to sleep is an irregular verb, the past simple form is slept. All right, the present perfect simple tense is formed by the verb have or has. So have for most subjects, and then has for the third person singular subject, plus the past participle. And if you recall, the past participle is identical to the past simple, the past simple form in regular verbs. But in irregular verbs, it is not identical to the past simple form. So really, it's a matter of memorizing the form. All right, let's look at the first function. The first function is action or situation that began sometime in the past and continues to the present. For example, I've lived in Geneva for over 35 years. So the implication of this sentence is that I'm still living there, because it's an action that began in the past, but it continues to the present. Another example is he has been an OPP officer since 1982. And again, the implication is that he's still an OPP officer. A second function of this tense is a recently completed action. Guess what? John has just won the lottery. So this is something that has happened very recently. And therefore you don't have to, you could say just. You could use the word just to emphasize the fact that it has happened very recently. But you could also use this tense for this function without just. A third function is an action that has occurred at an unspecified time in the past and may recur in the future. So keep in mind that it's an unspecified time in the past. So if you're using the present perfect simple tense with this meaning or function in mind, you can't specify the time. All right. So here's an example. I've seen that movie 5 times. Okay, so I haven't specified when I saw the movie. So therefore it would be incorrect to say I've seen that movie yesterday, because by saying yesterday you've specified the time. And so going back to the example, I've seen that movie 5 times. The implication of this is I may see it again in the future, you see. So obviously you cannot make the subject someone who's dead, right? Like, let's say John has passed away. You can't say John has seen that movie 5 times, because he's not going to see it again. He's dead, right? The implication is that he can see it again in the future. So therefore, it wouldn't make sense if you use a subject that is dead. He has read every one of Shakespeare's plays. Again, I haven't specified when, and the implication is that he may reread Shakespeare's plays in the future. In other words, that time period is not over. And in this case, that time period is his life. All right, now let's turn to the present perfect progressive tense. So we'll start by looking at how it's formed. We form this tense by adding the verb have or has, depending of course on the subject, plus the verb been, which is the past participle form of the verb to be, and the present participle, which is the ing form of the verb. The main function and purpose of this tense is to emphasize the continuous nature of an action which began sometime in the past and has continued to the present. So, for example, I've been living here for 10 years. And like the progressive tense, the present progressive or the past progressive tense, the present perfect progressive tense also is generally not used with state verbs. So therefore, you wouldn't say I've been seeing that movie 5 times, because seeing is a state verb. It describes a state and not a normal action. The original sentence read, I am waiting for you since 9 p.m. So rather than using the present perfect progressive, the present progressive was used. Okay. And the simple answer as to why we use the present perfect progressive is because this is an ongoing action that hasn't been completed yet. That began in some time in the past. Okay. And a good indicator for when we should use the perfect tense, the present perfect, whether it be progressive or simple, is the word since, the preposition since. So when we have since, we usually use the perfect tense, the present perfect tense. Originally, the second sentence read, I stay in Ottawa since Sunday. So we know that we use the present simple to talk about habits, okay, to talk about conditions, for example, or to state some sort of fact. In this sentence, though, that's not the case, okay? So it's something that it's an activity that began sometime in the past and it continues. It hasn't, it's not over. So it's still the case. So therefore, we would use the present perfect progressive. I have been staying in Ottawa since Sunday. So the meaning is that, on Sunday you're in Ottawa, and the time that you're saying this sentence, you're in Ottawa as well. How long time have you been living here? Okay. So the problem is that time is redundant, okay? Because when you say how long have you been living here, the meaning of time is already given, okay? And it's likely the learner has confused this expression with another expression where we do use time, and that is how much time. Like, how much time do you need to finish? Okay, but here it's not necessary, and in fact it's incorrect. All right, the fourth sentence, how long are you working here? So again, it's not the best. It's not the best tense to use. Okay, so the present continuous indicates that something is happening or is ongoing at the moment. Okay, but what we want to say is what we're trying to ask, in fact, or express in this question is, when did you start working? And how long has it been since you've started? Okay, and of course the implication is that the work or that you're still working here. Okay, so how long have you been working here? It is 3 years I haven't drunk coffee. Okay, so again, here we're talking about an action that began in the past and it continues, so it hasn't ended. Okay, so we would use the present perfect here. It has been 3 years since I have drunk coffee, and there's no need to make have negative because the meaning is already clear, right? So the meaning is that for the last 3 years you have not drunk any coffee. In the next sentence, it originally read, there's so long we we don't talk to each other. Okay. So again, just like the previous sentence, we're describing an activity that happened or didn't happen in the past, and it's continuing. So that state is continuing, it's not over. So therefore we would use the present perfect. It has been so long since we have talked to each other. And in both this sentence and the previous one, we use the present perfect in both the main clause, which is the first one in these sentences, and in the dependent clause, or the sentence after since. And finally, I had been there last year. Now, learners sometimes overuse the past perfect. Okay, sometimes they think that it sounds more academic or more native-like, so they'll use the past perfect when it's really not required. Now, as we said before, we use the past perfect when we're talking about two actions in the past and one action happened before the other. So for example, I could say, when I arrived at the bus station, the bus had already left. Okay, so there are two actions here, my arrival and the bus's departure. So what I'm saying here is that the bus left before I arrived. Okay, so there are two actions, one happened before the other, and we use the past perfect with the action that happened first. Okay, in this sentence though, there's only one action, and that's the action of being, which happened last year, right? So there's no other action in the sentence, so there's no need to use a past perfect. The past simple is more appropriate, and really the past perfect is simply unnecessary and perhaps even ungrammatical. I was there last year is what it should be. All right, now let's turn to the past perfect simple tense. All right, so how is it formed? Well, we form it by adding the verb had, so the past tense form of have, plus the past participle. And of course, the past participle for regular verbs is exactly the same as the past simple form, but for irregular verbs, it could take a number of different forms. So when do we use the past perfect simple? Well, we use it first of all to show that one action in the past took place before another action in the past. So for example, the thieves had gone when the police arrived. So the meaning of this is that the thieves left before the police arrived. So both of these things happened in the past, but one of them, the one that uses the past perfect, happened before the other. Prior to 1990, he had worked for the senator for 10 years. So here we have two things in the past, but not necessarily two actions. So we have the time phrase prior to 1990, and then the verb is in the past perfect. He had worked for the senator for 10 years. A second common use of the past perfect simple is for counterfactual conditionals. In other words, a type 3, as they're known in some grammar textbooks. For example, I could have called him if I had had his number. So the past perfect is in the if clause, if I had had his number. The first had is of course the helping verb had, and the second one is the main verb. Now, because had or the verb to have has two meanings, the first meaning is or the first function is the function of an auxiliary or a helping verb, and the second is it's a normal verb, and it has the meaning of possess. So in other words, you're saying if I had possessed his number. A third function of this tense is in reported speech. So if Ahmed were to say the following words, so these are exactly his words: I finished my report on time. And then if you were to report what Ahmed said, so you're reporting to someone what Ahmed had previously said, you would then take the past simple verb that Ahmed originally used in his utterance, and you would do what's called backshift, and you would change the tense from the past simple to the past perfect. So you would say Ahmed said that he had finished his report on time. The past perfect progressive tense. How is it formed? You add the verb had plus been, which is the past participle form of the verb to be, plus the present participle, so the ing form of the verb. We use this tense to show the continuous nature of an action which occurred before another action. So for example, they had been playing baseball before we arrived. She had been working on her paper for over an hour when Jack came home. So just like the present perfect simple and present perfect progressive, often we can use the two interchangeably. So rather than using the past perfect progressive, we could also use the simple form. And we could say, they had played baseball before we arrived, or she had worked on her paper for over an hour when Jack came home. So really the choice between the simple form and the progressive form is a choice of whether or not you want to emphasize the continuous nature of the action. So it's a more nuanced matter, and essentially the meaning is the same. So the difference is more nuanced than is the case with other tenses. The sentence originally read, why he hadn't been coming here. So here the mistake is that the subject, he, and the verb haven't been inverted. Okay, so in English, we form questions by inverting the subject and verb. So basically they switch places. Normally it's subject and then verb, but with questions it's verb and then subject. So we would say, why hadn't he been coming here? The hikers didn't drink anything for days when the paramedics arrived. Okay, so we're talking about two actions in the past. Okay, the drinking and the arrival of the paramedics, and because one action happened before the other, we're going to use the past perfect. Okay, so we're going to say the hikers hadn't drunk anything for days when the paramedics arrived. In the third sentence, it's a similar issue. So we have two actions in the past, and therefore, to make it clear to the listener or to the reader which action happened first, we're going to use the present perfect, or sorry, the past perfect with the action that happened first. When I arrived at the station, the bus had already left. In this next sentence, it originally read, my grandfather has always supported my career choices. Now, this could be correct if your grandfather is still living, okay? So it depends on the context. But let's assume that the grandfather is deceased, okay? He's passed away. In that case, we wouldn't use has, we would say had. So my grandfather had always supported my career choices. And the implication here is that before or prior to passing away. Okay, that's why we could use the past perfect here. Otherwise, you could simply say, my grandfather always supported my career choices. You could use the past simple as well. All right, in the last example, it originally read, she has been living in Quebec for more than 10 years, but still didn't speak French. Okay, so obviously we have here two actions in the past. We have, not speaking French, and then we have living. And because living happened prior to, of course, not speaking French, in the sense that you're saying that, this activity was going on before that activity or the lack of occurred. Okay, it might be a little difficult to conceptualize this because, of course, we're negating an action. But it's the same rule applies. So we would say she had been living in Quebec for more than 10 years, but still didn't speak French. All right, now let's look at the future simple. So there are various future simple forms. The most basic form of the future simple is the auxiliary verb will plus the base form of the verb. And this form of the future is used to refer to an unplanned, in other words, spontaneous event in the future. For example, I will turn the lights on. So normally, an action as mundane as this doesn't require planning and is or much deliberation. It's something you do on the spot. The thought comes to your mind, and before you know it, you carry out your thought. Another form of the future simple is the present form of the verb to be. So am, is, or are plus going to plus the base form. So in contrast to the previous form, we use this form when we're talking about a planned future event or prediction. For example, we're going to vacation in Florida this summer. It looks like it's going to rain soon. We can also express the future or talk about the future by using the present simple form. And we use this when we're talking about a timetable or a program. So for example, you would say the plane leaves in 1 hour. And finally, we can use the present progressive form to refer to the future, and in particular when we're talking about an arranged future event. For example, we're working this Saturday. All right, now let's look at the future simple, progressive, and perfect tenses. The future progressive is formed by adding the auxiliary verb will plus be plus present participle form. And it refers to an ongoing action in the often near future. I will be studying tomorrow if none of my friends call me. The future perfect is formed by adding the verb will plus have plus past participle. A future action will occur before another action in the future. So this is what it refers to and when the meaning that it gives. So for example, I will have finished before you arrive. So in other words, the action that I'm working on will be finished before your arrival. She will have read the entire book by 5 o'clock. So by the time it turns 5, she will have read the whole book. The whole book would have been read. In the first sentence, we originally had, will you work this weekend? Now, because this is something that is planned, it's not spontaneous, we wouldn't use will, but we would use the other future simple form, which is going to. And we would say, are you going to work this weekend? In the second sentence, it originally read, I'll play basketball tomorrow morning. So, same as the previous one, this is something that is planned. It's not spontaneous. It's not something that you would just think of on the spot, but it's something that is, most likely planned, because this isn't happening right now or in the very near future. It's going to happen tomorrow morning. Okay, so you've planned this out. So therefore, you would use going to. I am going to play basketball tomorrow morning. On the other hand, in this third example, it originally read, I'm going to open the window. Now, opening the window is usually something that's quite spontaneous. You enter a room, you might find it a bit chilly, and you then and there decide to close the window or open the window, depending on the room temperature. So it's spontaneous. That's the point. It's spontaneous. It's not planned. In the fourth example, it originally read, we'll call you when he'll arrive. Okay, so in this type of sentence, you have two clauses. Okay, you have the main clause, we'll call you, and then the dependent clause, when he arrives. So we only use the future simple in the main clause, okay? And in the when clause, we use the present simple. So therefore, it would read, we'll call you when he arrives. And the next sentence, it originally read, we are come to see the house this Saturday. So we are come, or even we come, is generally not appropriate to talk about the future. There are some exceptions where we would use the present simple, but that's for scheduled things, such as, let's say, airplane arrivals or departures. You would say, for example, the plane arrives in 30 minutes. However, we don't have that here. Okay, so this is something that is going to happen sometime this week, or on Saturday in particular. Okay, so we would use another form of the future, and that is the verb to be plus the ing. Okay, so essentially the present progressive form. We are coming to see the house this Saturday. And we can use the present progressive form to talk about the future when it's not a distant future, but it's the near future. Okay, so we have this Saturday, so we can assume it's going to be in a few days from the time that this is expressed. All right, in the next sentence, you originally had, will you driving home? Okay, So if you use will, then the main verb is going to be in the base form. Okay, so you wouldn't combine will with the ing, unless of course you use will plus to be plus ing, like I'll be arriving in a few minutes. I'll be arriving in a few minutes. But you don't have that here. You don't have the verb to be. So rather we would say, will you drive home? Will you drive home? And in the last sentence, it originally read, when you will write the exam. So in English, the general rule is, for questions, we invert the subject and predicate, or the subject and verb. Okay, so that means that normally it's subject and then verb, but in questions, it's going to be the verb and then the subject. Okay, and the verb that we invert is not the main verb, right, but the helping verb, will. When will you write the exam?